the paper has 3 epigraphs, so I'll read them and then get into the text. But also, this is an attempt at kind of big picture building, and I'm not sure whether it's banal or profound. Maybe it could be both, I don't know, but big pictures are embarrassing when you try to grapple with them. Okay, anyway. The 3 are all from Wallace Stevens. The first, we have never understood the world less than we do now, nor do we understand it, like it less. We never wanted to understand it more, or needed to like it more. These are the intense compulsions that challenge the poet as the appreciatory creator of values and beliefs. That finally states the problem. That doesn't state the problem, but second one, the poet increases the aspects of experience as in an enchantment. Fig will go on about as you'll see. And the third, each person completely touches us with what he is and as he is in the stale grandeur of annihilation. If I could write that one line, I would never write prose again. The stale grandeur and annihilation. Okay. I want to talk about the general argument of a book that I've just completed on Stevens that involves his responding to the pressures of his culture with relation to values, but also, I think, defining a certain kind of modernist engagement with values that I think is still alive in relation to literature. The problem is, and the banal part of this, at least one banal part of this talk, is that what Stevens takes as a frame to engage the question of values is primarily a kind of positivist outgrowth of empiricist notions about the opposition between value and fact. And I know, Stevens knew, that people like James or Bergson, especially those, or Dewey, were grappling with the problem of values differently. But for him, it's still, that was the shape for it. So I'll just use a statement by Wittgenstein, though it doesn't matter that it's Wittgenstein. There's a whole range of people thinking this way. A.J. Ayer was someone who actually Stevens read just because he felt he needed to respond to what was the current popular form of philosophical discourse. Anyway, all right, this is Wittgenstein in the Tractatus. The sense of the world must lie outside the world. In the world, everything is as it is, and everything happens as it does happen. In it, no value exists. And if it did, it would not have value, because if it existed, it would be fact. Right, so there's a sharp distinction between fact and value. The world is made of facts. Values are something not in the world, though they may be more important in the world, but that's another thing. Okay. What Stevens comes to later is the notion that value is not something built on fact, but is a reflective force enacted in the development of a particular interrelationship with fact. The question of what powers humans have to establish values becomes inseparable from the question of what powers poetry has to convert lyric utterance into the experience of observing the mind's unfolding relation to those aspects of the world in which it finds itself participating. So for Stevens, the participation is a kind of crucial word. Instead of a kind of mirror relation between value and fact, there's a kind of participatory relation of the mind with parts of the world and tries to find a space that they have in common that then it fleshes out. That's the basic vision. So another quotation from Stevens: the philosopher's world is intended to be a world which yet remains to be discovered, while the poet's world is intended to be a world which yet remains to be celebrated. Okay. Now, the shape of my argument is that there are two fundamental modernist shiftings of how one can think about value as to avoid the value-fact dichotomy without quite denying it, but just shifting it. And one is fundamentally Nietzschean, I think. The artist's version of the will to power simply legislates values in the attempt to make them sufficiently compelling that they'll eventually become facts. I mean, that's a great Nietzschean notion. You don't derive facts from value. You produce values, and if they work, they become facts. All right. And I think that has an affinity with, or at least helps articulate, what Yeats, Pound, Joyce, Mina Loy, and early Stevens, among the Anglo-American writers, were after. But later Stevens articulated for poetry a very different path. That this is if I go an hour, is that impolite by European standards? Okay. Anyway, I'll tell you a story. This woman applied for a job at Berkeley. We had a modern fiction job. And she gave this talk in which she laid out what I've been searching for 20 years for. Just kind of elemental description. And I couldn't get her hired because nobody cared except me. It was really kind of, it was glorious in the sense that I found this, kid, and terrible. I couldn't persuade my college. Anyway, what she did was just, she poses herself the problem, how do modernists deal with description? How can they keep writing fiction when they hate description? And yet, how can you have fiction without description? And what I loved about it is just so elemental. She said, well, they changed their term from description of a world to description like something. So description becomes a mode of involvement and an elaboration of the subject's position in the world, rather than a kind of articulation of the nature of the world from an imaginative point of view. She was talking about Proust and James and Woolf. But I think it really applies well to Stevens because he's a poet. He has to do different kinds of linguistic operations. But she also saw that if description is primarily a likeness relation rather than a pictorial relation, then simile becomes more important than metaphor. And that's part of the line that I want to take with Stevens. And if you know Ashbery at all, say, or a lot of the people like Ashbery, this is part of the real revolution in poetics, to make simile, or at least as relations, more important than metaphor. And it's interesting why. Metaphor is a sophisticated mode of naming. So that if poets prefer metaphor, they can claim, or literary critics can claim, that they're doing a kind of non-discursive knowing. But it's in the ballpark of the sciences. That's why metaphor got so popular, because the literary field, at least in the United States, was so uneasy that it would take any defense that could claim it to have a kind of affinity with science. Whereas simile is seen as ornament, as elaboration that doesn't name anything. But Stevens came along and Ashbery said, that's right, it doesn't name anything. It is. It's a kind of extension of the world. So rather than naming it, you do something with it, and you make that doing a kind of form of value. So that's the sort of basis of the shift along those lines. Okay. Stevens did not simply follow the novelist's wake, that is, Woolf and Proust. He developed processes of elaboration that invite our seeing poetry as continually operating on two tracks. Developing attitudes towards the world and toward how responsiveness to the world enters self-consciousness. And he used the concentration of lyric form to emphasize the capacities our grammar makes possible for establishing intricate states of equivalence that absorb description into a blend of making and displaying states of sensibility. That's what as does. I mean, it draws a parallel and then elaborates the significance of that parallel from a particular invested point of view. So this book that I've referred to elaborates possibilities of seeing Stevens' later work. Stevens' early work is very Nietzschean, actually. As a series of efforts to produce a poetry so intimate with modes of imagining and connected to our senses of value that it collapses the distance between making a poem and inhabiting an implied world. Stevens accomplishes this conceptually by evoking a set of practical ways in which value depends not on description or argument, but on principles involving the qualities of that constructed inhabitant, preeminently concepts of participation and realization. Participation in the flow of experience gets internalized, so that poetry can be considered complete only when it elicits the reader's own capacity to celebrate the changes that sensibility undergoes in the process of the elaboration of particulars. Again, what matters about a poem for Stevens, Late Stevens, is not, oh, this is true, but I can participate. I can take up that asness and flesh out that asness so it becomes my world. Okay. Another joke, just to break, you'll be brief later, but I once, this is again what Sasha caught, 30 years ago now, I was giving a talk about Az and Wallace Stevens. And at the end of this talk, this guy got up and said, enough of that, this ass-kissing, please do some literary criticism. But I still prefer, I will elaborate this, but, and so the concern for simile becomes in Stevens a marvelously complex meditation on how the intricate evasions of as produce structures of equivalence that ultimately flower in what I call aspectual thinking, constantly attuning itself to paths where celebration might be possible. Value is not something posited, but enacted in the development of a particular interrelationship with the processes of trying to inhabit what science seems content to describe. I think that to sort of have a sense of the value issue in modernism, I think it's good to keep both the Nietzschean and Proustian models in relation to each other as sort of exemplars of our capacities to develop and experience values. We might imagine Nietzsche as authorizing the construction of new names that flower in metaphor, while the other tradition learns to celebrate phenomena because of the capacity of the artist to dwell on spaces the imagination composes, alongside the orientations provided by our sensibility. It's also important that this approach be taken on Stevens, because Stevens' criticism is by and large still epistemic. That is, it's concerned primarily with issues about the imagination's adequacy to the world or evasiveness about the world. And I think that will never get to the celebratory dimension of Stevens. I mean, he's really not after the truth. He insists on responding to fact, but it's the qualities of the responsiveness that matters and not the fact of fact that matters. Okay, another quotation from Stevens. We've been a little insane about the truth. We've had an obsession. In its ultimate extension, the truth about which we have been insane will lead us to look beyond the truth, to something in which the imagination will be the dominant component. So that's my sort of emblem for trying to shift Stevens away from epistemic questions. Now, if I had time, there'd be 4 parts to this paper. 2 largely historical segments. I'm going to give you the feel for that. One as a kind of demonstration of how, for much of Romantic poetry, value was conceived as an extension of fact, and hence a fulfillment of epistemic culture rather than a challenge to its authority. And that was a nightmare for the Victorians, because they couldn't get the two together, and that was the only model of value they had, really. Oh, actually, it was the only model of value they had to connect to the world in Victorian writing. So the Victorian writing is kind of in England, is a long process of sort of expelling the desire to have a world of fact at all. It's one of the saddest bodies of writing. And what they develop instead, which is part of my system of antagonism, the only value they could find was morality. Every time I hear someone invoke morality, telling you, I think, oh, you poor bastard, you're stuck. You haven't got anything better than that. This is a slightly more aggressive statement than I feel, but it's worth thinking about in those veins. Then, so I'm not going to talk really about the Thoreau's talk, but it fits into this picture. And then I'll talk a little bit about how Pound works a kind of Nietzschean model, and so that's why the Pound poem is up there. And then talk about Stevenson. Okay. And I'll stop at what? 5:10, 5:15, so I just stop. Okay. So now, first I want to indicate what I mean by romantic collusion with the epistemic value. It sounds sinister, right? I like collusion with epistemic value. By asking you to look briefly at Wordsworth's sonnet composed upon Westminster Bridge, September 3rd, 1798. The poem offers a clear example of the romantic imagination building on facts so that knowledge can guide feelings. So, this city now doth like a garment wear the beauty of the morning, silent, bare, then I was going to skip. Never did sun more beautiful, steep in his first splendor, valley, rock, or hill. Ne'er saw I, never felt a calm so deep. The river glided at his own sweet will. Dear God, the very houses seem asleep, and all that mighty heart is lying still. So as all the facts build up as the sun shines, in effect, it sustains the metaphor of that mighty heart lying still, right? And so there's this kind of the poetry is the rhetoric of the celebration of the correlation of desire with fact. I mean, that's the way Wordsworth's imagination weaves itself into a description of detail so that his presence becomes increasingly eloquent as it expands its capacity for discovering the general within the particular. All right. And analogously, remember, there's a great passage in the Prelude when Wordsworth thinks he's crossed the Alps, he gets depressed because his imagination wanted to go up and he has to go down. But then there's this recuperation of what the descent means as a physical fact, and then there's all sorts of metaphors that emerge as he reconnects to this process. Okay, so we're done with romanticism. But I think you'll find it not inaccurate, especially in Wordsworth. There's no better moment than the conclusion of Arnold's The Scholar Gypsy to illustrate how the sense of value seems to become incompatible with that world of fact. At first, how many people have read The Scholar Gypsy? Just out of curiosity. Okay, that's very interesting. For those in the front, nobody, so you don't feel bad about missing it. It's a great, sad poem, actually. All right. At first, the speaker imagines including the gypsy, so that he runs into this gypsy figure who's kind of alien to the world, and at first he tries to talk the gypsy into becoming the world, because he's a Victorian and the world is supposed to be a good place. And also Wordsworth could include these marginal figures like leech gatherers. So why can't Arnold include these figures who threaten to divorce nature from culture? But then the speaker reflects further on his world, and he starts to think about this ascendant spirit of empiricist positivism, the transparent proliferation of capitalist wills to power, the nomination of mob rule in the name of democracy, and he decides that the only self-respecting option is to encourage that figure on the margins to flee any further contamination by the speaker's social context. For Arnold, these descriptions of his world simply will not evoke any penumbra of values that will appeal to the imagination. Both the natural and the social worlds could offer only mockeries of what once had been a world that opened continually in something like spiritual presence and self-focus. But fly our paths, our feverish contact fly, for strong the infection of our mental strife, which though it gives no bliss, it spoils for rest. And we should win thee from thy old fair life, like us distracted, and like us unblessed. Soon, soon thy chair would die. In this world, description is conquered, right? Fact is conquered. I was just fantasizing as a graduation speech, right? This notion that, just get away from it all. Don't don't enter. But I mean, that's the essence of that sensibility. The contamination is greater than the release. So within this Victorian sensibility, lacking grounds for feelings in nature, the writers tended to examine their own capacities to make moral judgments. However, these hard-won moral commitments then have a tendency to take up the entire domain of values, as we see partially in the way that the quoted passage from Arnold cultivates a bleak honesty, whose only justification can be how it maintains the speaker's dignity, even as he despairs of adapting that dignity to anything that will alter prevailing bleakness. It's as if a general morality had to be invented to domesticate and dignify what Wordsworth saw as the awful, unfathered power of imagination. But this morality, born in bleakness, can only feed on itself, since it banishes everything else to the domain of illusion or confusion. It is the moralizers themselves who seem to invite Nietzsche's pleas for an extra moral sense of the world. And I think when I read literary criticism now, I think that we haven't changed from this Victorian obsession with, we call it ethics now, it's supposed to carry value instead of moralism. But it's, it doesn't change anything. Why? Because it narrows the field of values to a kind of field of interpersonal choices, and at least implicitly, a kind of obligation rather than a celebration. I mean, that's the, so I'm going to write that down. Sorry. I mean, in my waning years, my priesthood is this attack on morality. So, I fact, about the first day I wrote that. All right. Now, modernism has its echoes of Victorian self-patheticizing bleakness. One needs only to think about the wasteland, but that's not fair. Equally important is the pressure of Victorian heritage refusing to grant the possibility that the domain of value is substantially larger and more capacious than the domain of the moral. But there is another strand within the philosophical backgrounds to modernism that sounds a very different note. So I want to hear that note playing through the rest of this study. So I'll spend a few moments elaborating why Nietzsche proved so timely a thinker in his efforts to revalue all values. Modernist poets' commitments to reorient how art can present and mediate compelling values has significant correlates in many modern philosophical efforts to escape the claim that values should be based on fact. Bergson and Heidegger challenged the idea that facts could be independent of values in the first place. James, Dewey, Bradley all stressed the domain of prior projective human actions that give facts a useful place within cultural frameworks. But only Nietzsche, I think, fully sponsors the spirit of combat and the quest for the ecstatic that becomes possible when we see Victorian laments about the divorce between fact and value as terrifying failures to respect human powers to create values or dwell in value-laden context. And I was telling Sasha, my Nietzsche is just the popular Nietzsche. It's not sophisticated at all, because the writers got it largely, like Picasso got it from the nightclubs in Barcelona. He didn't read very much. So it's important, that, especially with Nietzsche, that the boldness of his rhetoric is such that he can be communicated in nightclubs, I think, though probably Nietzsche scholars will correct this assertion. But, and I like the idea of wisdom in nightclubs on that. All right. So three basic statements from Nietzsche that dictate the three themes that I think get correlated in the writing. All the latter start in Nietzsche's acute and compelling critique of the epistemic culture that had dominated intellectual life since the Enlightenment. He made clear how the philosophical practice of grounding values in facts that could carry truth value, did not so much celebrate the mind's analytic powers as threatened to impoverish experience by reducing it to the endless observation and testing of largely isolated phenomena. There is no sense in these descriptions of physiological demands for a certain type of life, and so no way to register the kind of nobility that experiences itself as determining values. It does not need approval, it judges. It knows itself to be that which first accords honor to things. It is value creating. Everything it knows as part of itself, it honors. Okay, so this is the first feature. Value doesn't derive from knowing. Value dictates the possibilities of arenas of knowing. The second, on the basis of this critique of empiricism, he could suggest a philosophical approach to art whose significance is still rarely discussed. There could be an aestheticism that was not at all beholden to formalism, yet capable of resisting positivist pictures of why picturing the world is so foundational. Nietzsche's emphasis on the aesthetic does not address the shape of the aesthetic object per se, but concentrates instead on the work the object does in fostering appreciation for various existential situations. Another long quote. Every artist knows how far from any feeling of letting himself go his most natural state is. The free ordering, placing, disposing, giving form in the moment of his inspiration, and how strictly and subtly he obeys thousandfold laws. Precisely then, laws that precisely on account of their hardness and determination defy all formulation through concepts. Even the firmest concept is, compared with them, not free of fluctuation, multiplicity, ambiguity. Third, this constellation of critique with the celebration of multiple modes of experiencing that, with multiple modes of experiencing values, made it possible to produce a withering account of how morality had become the sole philosophical garden of the place of value in the world. Or to put this case, for Nietzsche, the ethical is wrong from the start. It entails separating human life into domains like ethics and aesthetics that then must posit some external criterion that has the authority to make such divisions. In addition, ethics must explain how an analogous external authority, usually attributed to reason or to inner law, can take priority over the individual's specific valuations in particular circumstances. In contrast, if value resides primarily in how agents become or realize who they are, the domain of the moral can only haunt the expressive as its negation, as a mark that the individual has conformed to some version of the pressure of the general and subsumed action into making a copy of something. Another small quote. Man, I could just earn my money just reading Nietzsche too. I think I did far better. Man, a manifold, mendacious, artificial, and opaque animal. Again, uncanny to the other animals, less because of his strength than because of his cunning and shrewdness, has invented the good consciousness to enjoy his soul for once as simple. The whole of morality is a long, undismayed forgery, which alone makes it at all possible to enjoy the sight of the soul. From this point of view, much more may belong in the concept of art than is generally believed. So art is not an escape from the moral, but the vehicle by which expression enters into mortal combat with morality to determine what the ultimate models of valuation will become. All right. Now, I'm not saying that writers read Nietzsche and trotted off as good little Nietzscheans to do their work, right? But it was a kind of part of the atmosphere in which writers were trying to both to find and to appreciate, or to appreciate the work of, not basing stuff on representation or copies or abstract wisdom at the other pole, right? So now the pound poem. I think it accomplishes much of what Nietzsche is suggesting without either the overstatement or the mixtures of self-irony and self-pity, which I've excised from the Nietzsche quoted. Okay. 3 spirits came to me and drew me apart to where the olive boughs lay stripped upon the ground, pale carnage, bright mist. So you're going to say, what the hell's different about this? I mean, right? This is just bad Wordsworth. I mean, so what is the difference? Well, the one thing you have to hear is how much sound becomes this kind of celebration of the making and an index of the degree to which the writer is producing something that he or she doesn't want to be read as a copy, but something as kind of direct celebration that indicates how the rest of the context can be developed. So, pale carnage beneath bright mist, I think is just fantastic line, just for sound. The first half with the A's, the second half with the I's, and the middle word, the middle alliteration sort of linking the two, right? All right. Hugh Kenner has a book called The Pound Error, which he talks about pounds change from melodic lines like Tennyson's and Keats's to harmonic lines with these kind of sharp edges and then bridges between those edges. So this is a kind of, I think, example of that. They're not rhetorical in the sense of eloquent. They not seem to intensify as the speaker's consciousness grows more comfortable and vital within the world given by the senses. And even this sense of sound contributes to the difference in how the senses are treated. Why does it take spirits to lead the speaker to the vision of pale carnage beneath bright mist? Perhaps the poet has to expand ordinary seeing in order to appreciate poetic space as something that does not emerge only from intensified perception, but instead as a kind of spiritual gift given by the discovery of what precise composition can actually afford perception. And I mean, I think precise composition and what it can afford. Let me now cast this some observations in a more pretentious language. Where is fact and where is value in this poem? If the value of the language does not emerge from within the speaker's presence in the scene, where does it come from? Why might epistemology have become an inadequate model for what poetry depends on to have its effects in the world? We could say, if we weren't pretentious academics, we could say simply that Pound wanted to call attention to how art is a distinctive mode of composing that does not so much emerge from experience as make experience worthy of attention for the three spirits. I mean, to say, hey, spirits, well, look at what I'm doing is a pretty kind of bold act, right? So what can he do to justify this claim on the spirits? Well, I think these questions require Hegel of all things. Pound would have been appalled to invoke Hegel, but there's a particular move of Hegel's that's not sufficiently valued in at least literary criticism of Reed's philosophy that I want to adapt to. So, most applied Hegel focuses on transformations of the subject as it modifies the conditions of self-consciousness. For example, by how the subject moves from stoicism to skepticism to unhappy consciousness. But Hegel is equally interested in the transformation to our ideas of substance as spirit alters modes of self-consciousness. April does not present the world as pre-existing, and so it does not it does not quite challenge the poet to find a language that might bring vitality to fact. Rather, the poem makes it seem that we begin not with the world, but with a certain condition of emotion that's inseparable from the language the poem finds for it. The poem makes carnage work because it finds an appropriate place in a system of imaginative forces. Think also of the beginning of Tender Buttons. I mean, it's all about finding placements rather than finding description. Here, intense materiality is completely aligned with how the imagination can do its work in the world. The interrelation of April with carnage gives a quite different sense of substance because the object is no longer something afforded by description and supplemented by imagination. I mean, he doesn't talk about, oh, there's all this wasted stuff and look at this wasted piece and other ways. It's all carried by carnage, right? So carnage becomes the right word. And it becomes so much the right word that it carries the whole descriptive obligation as a word. I mean, that's my argument. The object just is what language confers on the scene for the reader. The emotions and reflections language composes completely establish what spirits can see in April. So le mot juste is not a state of description, but rather of celebration, that there can be the discovery of carnage, to express all the effects of what is involved in this three spirits' attention to this aspect of April. The making of art composes the kind of substance in which these spirits, and spirit in general, can see their own interest objectified, and given the kind of vitality that the art object can confer. Town shows the way to this larger theater, and for the people, we'll do the cantos tomorrow, and we'll sort of elaborate these various features of placement in town. Town shows the way to this larger theater where something indubitably spiritual seems inseparable on a constitutive level from the immediacies of sensation. Now, Stevens' harmonium will offer much the same celebration as Pound of what the imagination constitutes, although with more elaborate versions of the imaginative life staged by the ego. And later Stevens will try many routes to naturalizing this constitutive activity by making participation align with construction, so that the audience can see itself as transforming the processes by which it composes objectivity. I didn't realize until I read this sentence at 5, but now. So my argument is that the Stevensian view that I'm now going to move to, the values in late Stevens, it's not antithetical to the Nietzschean, but it kind of grounds the Nietzschean in a kind of responsiveness by a particular agent to the world. So it's not so insistently creative as a kind of value frame. All right. So while Stevens shares Pound's commitment to intensity and to power, his poetry is more concerned than Pound's with the nuances of how that power adapts to what Stevens calls reality. So as I turn to Stevens, I'll try to bring out both the common sense of what the modernist poet has to do to change the culture's ways of thinking about values, and Stevens' particular version of inhabiting a cultural moment that had Nietzsche as one of its most basic and potentially powerful elements. In his essay, Imagination and Its Value, which Stevens wrote in 1948, Stevens offers a simple definition that's nonetheless remarkably concise and precise and capacious in its abstraction, and indeed in its demand for abstraction in poetry. This definition suggests why value is not derived from fact, but testable against it. So, the imagination is the power of the mind over the possibilities of things. The power of the mind over the possibilities of things. But if this constitutes a certain general characteristic, it is the source not of certain single values, but of as many values as reside in the possibilities of things. Then, in order to handle the need to discriminate among these possibilities, Stevens develops a contrast between the force of imagination that results in specific images of what can be valued, and the force of imagination that manifests itself as a process continually altering the domain of images without allowing itself to become allied with a specific set of images, which then it would be a description or copy. This distinction is necessary because of the dangerous tendency that he saw in Romanticism to naturalize these possibilities by turning them into images. Stevens is a kind of abstraction of Romanticism, and he feels that romantic content is sentimental because it locates the value again in the world rather than in the work on the world, even though it has the structure of possibility of locating it in the work of the world. Romantic desire defines by contrast what for Stevens has to be the aspiration of a truly modern art. The mind manifest in such art must be sufficiently abstract to project its power over the possibility of things by continually maintaining a productive tension between the domain of possibility and the domain of things. If images tend to become a mockery of our powers of establishing values, perhaps something like the voice in poetry can preserve our access to the underlying forces that grapple to replace one image with another. I mean, part of, I think, Stephen's difference from the early Pound, even this constructed early Pound, is that he destructs images because they always get on the dump. They become parts of history. But the voice has a kind of, it retains a kind of power within history. So it's as if you can't, make a sharp dichotomy between image and voice. But insofar as the differences hold, you can separate early Pound and late Stevens along those lines, and you can imagine how voice could. Let me make a kind of silly statement, but I think it's right. That because it's always easier to deal with the content of poetry than the activity of poetry. We tend to underplay the importance of voice as a phenomenon, as a physical phenomenon that poetry makes us aware. That's why there's rhythms, I mean, for one thing. So a lot of Stevens, I think, he's rhetorical, not as a preacher with content, but rhetorical so you hear voices. And you hear what the content of a voice is. All right. Imagination has to be abstract in Stevens because it must go beyond individual fictions to stage, time, and place as these perfect themselves. And so call to our attention the extent of the artifice within us, and almost parenthetically, with the question of its value. Ultimately, imagination's status as the power over the possibility of things emerges in poetry as the felt sense of a fit between a vocabulary voice and an occasion in which the imagination finds a plausible place as the power we need to address something like an abstraction of need itself. So, the poem is kind of a testing of how the imagination can respond to these various needs born of the culture. All right. This is Stevens again, quote. The poet tries to exemplify it, in part as I have tried to exemplify it here, this is value, by identifying with an imaginative activity that diffuses itself throughout our lives. I say exemplify and not justify, because poetic value is an intuitional value, and because intuitional values cannot be justified. For example, Stevens is fascinated by as constructions, primarily because they have the capacity to treat matter as also matter, and so establish equivalences among processes in time and space. There he walks and talks as he lives and likes, right? So as he lives and likes is a temporal, walks and talks as he lives and likes, but also in the mode of, in the quality of his living and liking. All right, so that's kind of the duality that he loves as is for. The poem can produce images that are not bound to other extraneous objects, but enter into vast and mobile assemblages of other images, all capable of entering reality in many dimensions. All right, now finally, concrete example of a Stevens poem, and a kind of illustration. Well, let me ask the questions then. How can examples make manifest what Stevens means by the power of mind? This is a crucial question. How can it be plausible to envision the mind's power over the possibility of things as something other than what can be represented by formulating specific beliefs? How did this poetry make manifest and significant these powers, as imaginative diction, as eloquence, as control of a metaphor, as what his essays call powers of resemblance and analogy, and as an often brilliant expansion of what is involved in our abilities to explore the many facets of the grammar of as that mobilizes this sentence, right? So this sentence is about all these asnesses that could be hung up within poetry. Stevens' essay is entitled Imagination as Value rather than Imagination of Value. This enables him to call attention to quiet modes of valuing by drawing equivalences that are built into our practices of using language. Let me do the poem now. This is section 12 of Ordinary Evening in New Haven, So it's about 1952. Got it? Yeah. The poem is the cry of its occasion, part of the rest, and not about it. The poet speaks the poem as it is, not as it was. Part of the reverberation of a windy night as it is, when the marble statues are like newspapers blown by the wind. He speaks, by sight and insight, as they are. There is no tomorrow for him. The wind will have passed by, the statues will have gone back to being things about. The mobile and the immobile flickering in the area between is and was are leaves. Leaves burnished in autumnal burnished trees, and leaves in whirlings in the gutters, whirlings around and away, resembling the presence of thought, resembling the presences of thoughts, as if, in the end, in the whole psychology, the self, the town, the weather, in a casual litter, together, said words of the world on the life of the world. Here we might say value resides within the processes of how the world comes to resemble the presence of thought. Certainly the poem spells out how the imagination works in relation to the statue and the windy night. But its task is not just to realize how those figures take on a new life. The poem also tries to embody the force of such imagining as it dramatizes thinking's power to find a home in the world and to appreciate the value of this home. The speaking is fundamentally the undoing of distance between mind and world, I think. I think Stevens feels that language is a kind of closing of distance. And part of my view of values is like, it's a crucial value to lessen distance between people, be a little bit less defensive, right? That's the domain of values that he's really interested in, phenomenological shifts in sensibility. Okay. The first three stanzas render a particular occasion from which the poem emerges as a cry. Stevens does not say what kind of cry, pain or ecstasy or both possible, because he wants to call attention to this cry as a sheer condition of being, not as a response to something that can be described independently of the poem. He also somewhat strangely begins with a complex situating of the poet's act before he describes the scene. Probably he thought he had to characterize the quasi-disembodied or constantly changing stance of this poem as the basic grounding context for the reverberations of the windy night that the poem eventually releases. Then the poem can be part and fully participate in the windy nights transforming the weight of statues into a striking mobility. The statue, oddly, matters more for its mobility as part of the scene than for any reference the images might have to nobility or to authority. This point seems to me a really crucial feature that usually, Stevens wrote an essay about this actually, statues are usually commemorative of something, right? This statue had no commemoration. The statue is part of the scene, and the statue is liberated to the scene from its meaning, right? I mean, that's, this mobility also can provide a source of value without any limitation about lost nobilities that the statue might now signify. What the statues might mean is far less important than what they become to the imagination in the precise moment in which they seem transformed. That is how sight seems to blend with insight, as they are, in time, and in the capacity to elicit imaginative response. I think two more pages. So, it is as this absorption and reflective process manages to naturalize the. What the hell? Oh. See? Let's try this way. It is as if this absorption in reflective processes manages to naturalize the being of the statues, while actively forgetting that the usual task of statues is to mean something by offering signs of virtues a culture should value. So poetry is no longer an act of rhetorical persuasion. It seeks so much more than that of its audience. It does not want to evoke belief, but to elicit self-reflection on what is involved in participating in this scene of metamorphosis. Participation offers an alternative to resting content with description that in turn stands for meaning. Participation is continuous activity. It involves opening oneself to all the equivalences that can occur when there emerges a cry as a response to an occasion. In fact, now the poem realizes that participation may be definable simply as replacing a concern for aboutness with a concern for focusing all of one's capacities for feeling on the reverberations established by the equivalences that the imagination makes. Sight and insight, then, cannot be measured by the objects they bring into view. Sight and insight here become variable elements, depending entirely on how one comes to participate in the reverberations they allow. When I teach Stevens, I love to expound on the first three stanzas of this passage, which I've just been doing. Now, though, I'm beginning to realize what I missed when I stopped there. I see Stevens asking us, in the last part of the poem, to imagine a mental state that can exist between is and was, and so between Pound's sort of constatation, making present, and lack or melancholy. Notice how the fourth stanza shifts the focus from the wind to the leaves themselves. Stevens promptly does that for two reasons. First, the leaves as simple phenomena prove the perfect inhabitants of the space between is and was. They bear the marks of time, and they carry all the expansiveness of entire autumnal season that in many ways also exists between is and was. Just as a digression, this is from the volume Auroras of Autumn, in which Stevens is trying to expand into a kind of recognition of loss and sadness systematically that still can be embraced by the imagination. So this space between is and was is really kind of the space that a lot of these poems construct. Simply the expansion from one evening to autumn, in the last section of this poem, provides another context for that cry and shows how, as the poem participates in the evening, it also takes on possible metaphoric registers that develop the shift to a more melancholy tone. More important, the shift to leaves begins a series of resemblances that reinforces this sense of expansion. From leaves to thoughts to words, it is as if the occasion were moving from the scenic to the philosophical, from watching to speaking in a new way. Here, words lose all their rhetoricity, and hence their verbality, because they're only parts of the scene, almost parallel to the detritus. Freed from serving only as anchors in the physical world, they all together say, not cry, but say that they're free to adapt themselves to serving as aspects of the life of the world as it can become with their participation. Value itself depends not on fact, but on a responsiveness to the world that remakes how words can dramatize the will to honoring experience without moralizing it. Stevens, to me, licenses the project of exploring what we might call, I can't read my handwriting, so thank you for attention, and I'm sorry. This must be like the worst ending of a talk. It's like detumescent, like in the highest possible degree. But this is me, as Karen said.